Tonight, veterans who say they were kicked out of the military because of their sexuality are headed to court, but it's not money they want, the groundbreaking lawsuit. Plus, a massive Hawaiian wildfire fueled by a hurricane. And who was the newest billion-dollar jackpot winner on the CBS Evening News?
The majority still rules in Ohio.
The ex-president was at the center of that multifaceted plot to overturn the election.
Are you prepared to declare a national emergency with respect to climate change?
We've already done that.
Hello, I'm Caitlin Huey-Burns in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. Newly unsealed court records show special counsel Jack Smith's team obtained a search warrant for former President Trump's Twitter account earlier this year. The filings show a judge later gave the platform, now known as X, a $350,000 fine for missing the deadline to comply. A legal battle has played out regarding the warrant behind closed doors for months. For more on this, senior legal affairs reporter for Politico, Kyle Cheney, joins us now. Kyle, good to see you. Thanks for being here. So what kind of information were prosecutors looking for from the account?
So we don't actually know that. There's not a lot of details about what they wanted, but what we can discern, I mean, what they would theoretically get from a search warrant of Donald Trump's Twitter account is, number one, probably where the account was being used, so IP address. So was it Donald Trump himself personally sending tweets, for example, when he told his supporters to come to Washington for a wild protest? Or could it have been an aide and an advisor who had access to the account? And that may be necessary to determine, was it Donald Trump himself sending out these messages, or could it have been somebody else?
And do you have any idea about why the court didn't disclose the warrant earlier?
Sure. So this is all happening in the context of, secret grand jury investigation. This was, again, the warrant was issued in January, and that's the judge determining there's probable cause to think that the crime was committed and that evidence of that crime could be found in Donald Trump's Twitter account. They don't want to tip off Donald Trump. They don't want to tip off anybody else who might be part of this investigation that this warrant's been issued, and potentially encourage them to hide evidence or change their behavior or whatever. That's a standard criminal investigation tactic. So they didn't want this information coming out sooner than it had to.
And while we have you, I want to ask about this new memo that we've been learning about today. It essentially lays out Trump's strategy for trying to overturn the 2020 election. What more can you tell us about this?
Sure. So actually, this is part of a series of memos by one of the attorneys who's listed as a co-conspirator in the indictment, Kenneth Cheesebro, and he sort of laid out the intellectual framework for arguing that these false electors should be meeting in state capitals on December 14th, 2020, that Mike Pence should be to declare his authority to overturn the election single-handedly. And what you see in these memos, and including the new one that was released, is how he turned it from, this is just a safeguard, a backup plan in case we win any court battles, to let's do this to put the pressure on Pence to actually create a reason for Congress to challenge the results. And here's the plan for putting this in action. So it became a theory to an action plan to a plan to pressure Pence, essentially.
And a plan put on paper, no less. Kyle Cheney, thank you so much for your time and reporting. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Voters in Ohio have rejected a proposal that would have made it more difficult to change the state's constitution. Abortion rights supporters are celebrating the outcome of that vote, and that's because there's a ballot question on enshrining reproductive rights in the Ohio Constitution in November. So for more on this, Finn Gomez joins us now, friend of the program. He's also CBS News political director. Finn, good to see you. So this Ohio vote we've been covering for a while now, and I know it was kind of nuanced, but essentially this was sending a huge message across the country that even in a conservative state like Ohio, this is an issue that is mobilizing voters. And I'm curious, from your reporting and from what we've seen throughout this year, this seems to send a message to Republican voters that this is a real potent issue in politics.
Yeah, and it's still galvanizing forces against the even in these, like you mentioned, like even in your own reporting, of course, in these Republican strongholds like Ohio, that has become increasingly a red state. And when you're seeing this this alliance of progressives, of Democrats, of women voters, of even moderate Republicans coming and showing that they can come out in a state like this. In a state that Donald Trump last two times by 8 points, I think it shows that they can really do. What does that say for the national landscape and other battleground states?
Yeah, it's really interesting that you mentioned that, because when you look at Trump, you know, how Trump did, he won that state by about 8 points. And in every county, we saw that this measure, overperformed or underperformed his numbers. So that shows that there's, some bipartisan support here. Democrats definitely see this as a galvanizing issue for them. The question, though, is can they sustain it, and does it necessarily translate to support for Democratic candidates? That seems to be a challenge for the party as well, kind of keeping that up.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think this was a big question following last year's success. Remember, the Republicans' underperformance. One of the main reasons it was accredited to was because of the reversal Roe v. Wade. Now we're here in August ahead of this November race, and it's still galvanizing folks. It still has this power to do that. And really, if you're looking at some of these numbers, some of these results show that Republicans are struggling to adjust on how to do that, how to counter that in these states. So I think even though we're a couple of months from November from that election where the constitutional amendment will be on the ballot, and again the main election in a year from that November, it's still fueling voters to go out to the polls.
Yeah, and that's a really good point too, because Ohio is probably the only state that will have a ballot measure this year.
Right.
But next year, other states are working, including Arizona. They're trying to get something on the ballot in that big battleground state. And speaking of Arizona being a big battleground state for the presidential, but also a huge Senate race that we've been talking about for months, looking into that. Kari Lake, Republican who ran for governor, was unsuccessful, but is a Trump acolyte, is kind of putting it out there that she may be running for Senate. That seems to run counter to what Republicans have said about trying to focus on candidate quality. I mean, what kind of impact would that have on the race?
I mean, yeah, like you're absolutely right. Even NRC Chairman Senator Daines basically said that it might be a tough uphill climb for her. By the way, CHP, she still hasn't conceded her loss, their gubernatorial loss to Katie Hobbs from last year. I mean, this is someone who is like the ultra MAGA, candidate in that state where the McCain Republicans came out and voted for the Democrat against her. I mean, is that really the best candidate that Republicans have to have in that battleground state in a 2024 cycle? And it could be a three-way race, between Senator Kyrsten Sinema running as an independent now, and likely Ruben Gallego, the House Democrat, who has been galvanizing progressive and youth and Latino voters in that state.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned Senator Daines, who chairs the NRSC. He actually sat down with Major Garrett recently. I want to play a little bit of their conversation because it speaks to exactly what you were talking about.
You want to make sure you're focused on the future. They don't want to hear about grievances of the past. They want to know what are you going to do to address the problems of this country and looking forward.
So Kari Lake's not someone you would see yourself and the committee supporting?
Well, we've had conversations with Kari.
Long conversations. She was here. She sat down with you for several, almost 2 hours.
We had a very good discussion about what's it mean to win in Arizona, and talking about the future. Casting.
Was she receptive?
She was. It was a very robust. It was a good discussion.
So he says that she was receptive, but what she's been saying on the trail suggests otherwise. And she's been out there campaigning. I mean, she was in Ohio, for example, campaigning, and she's been out there a lot. This seems like an issue that the party, needs to address, but they're really tiptoeing around it.
Right. All signs seem to indicate that she is going to be running and is staffing up and for a launch in potentially in October. So I think, if she is being receptive, I don't know how receptive, as you said, she is being to that line of thinking. I think, and as you mentioned, she has been at all these big conservative gatherings throughout the cycle. You've seen her, on Newsmax, on all these other right-wing outlets where she is speaking to a base that really adheres to that very MAGA base of supporters.
Trump is the nominee, she'll be out there a lot. Speaking of if Trump's the nominee, that is kind of the big question facing a lot of his rivals as they're preparing for the debate stage. We've talked a lot about making the debate requirements in terms of polling and donor thresholds, but there's also a debate qualification that isn't talked about as much, and that's signing this loyalty pledge. And Vivek Ramaswamy, who's gained some interest among voters, has said that he's the only candidate so far that's actually signed that pledge to support the eventual nominee. My question is, how does the RNC actually enforce that at all? I mean, is that kind of just a phony pledge at this point?
Well, they say that it has a real impact on those who do not sign it, right? I do think it's the last of the criteria after they hit the 40,000 unique donors, after they hit the requiring polling standing in the pollings that they acknowledge. But Vivek has signed it, but others have been hesitant or have been very critical of it, including Donald Trump. Will Hurd has been critical of it. I don't know if he's going to make the debate stage with that criteria, but others, like Chris Christie, if they don't sign it, you're right. Does it have the teeth to really stop a candidacy in this race? Does it really have the teeth to really dissuade someone? And the fact of the matter is, we're still waiting to see if Donald Trump goes to this first debate. It's only a couple weeks away, Caitlin.
Yeah, and whether he'll sign it. Chris Christie has said, he'll take it as seriously as Trump did the last time around. So it kind of speaks to, but to your point, I mean, the broader question of, are these candidates, they're dancing around the idea of whether they would support Trump if he were the nominee. So just a couple weeks to go until that big debate, and we'll see what happens then. Finn Gomez, thank you so much for that. And speaking of Donald Trump, he hasn't backed down this week from going on the attack regarding those criminal cases against him. Next, Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren, who served on the House January 6th committee, will join us to discuss the former president's mounting legal challenges. You're streaming America Decides.
It's important to our nation.
I wonder how you think about where America is at this moment.
It's on Face the Nation.
Can there be stability if Vladimir Putin remains in power?
Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan on CBS.
America Decides, taking you inside American democracy.
The most important stories on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis.
You're going to hear a lot of reporting.
It is clearly a pivotal moment.
Gun control, the economy, education. Both sides of the political aisle fight it out for power.
Bringing you the analysis that you need.
Thoughtfully, with context.
Be part of the conversation.
On CBS News Streaming.
Welcome to America Decides.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
I always tell people that Twitter would not be Twitter without Black Twitter. It's just us being in fellowship with each other.
And it becomes a conversation you don't want to be left out of.
People really started to recognize the power of activism on Twitter.
Based on that one tweet, the hashtag #OscarSoWhite was trending around the world.
If anything has really powered Black Twitter, it's been humor.
If your food ain't right, we're going to tell you about that, too.
We tend to create change, create culture and cool.
That's how movements happen on Black Twitter and go beyond more than that.
Black Twitter, the Twitterverse that changed a generation. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
When weather turns extreme.
The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
CBS News and the Weather Channel bring you virtual weather technology. So advanced, so real.
Let's bring in our partners at the Weather Channel.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
Feel the forecast. Streaming on CBS News.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
The carnage in our nation's schools has become painfully repetitive.
Not one more child!
School shootings have parents fighting mad.
I promised my daughter I was going to fight. It's going to keep on happening.
And teachers taking lessons in how to fight back.
This is an exercise.
We approach it as it's you or them.
It shouldn't have to be your teacher's job to protect your life.
But will the battle over gun control,
people are afraid that they're going to lose their gun rights altogether,
be the hardest lesson of all?
The exercise, you're having to shoot at an adult. Are you prepared to have to kill one of your students?
Guns in the Classroom, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
She's the most successful alpine skier, male or female, ever, and a worldwide inspiration.
We need a lot of women doing sports really, really well.
The story of Michaela Schifrin's game-changing reign at the top of the slopes when we go person to person.
He chose to try to stay in office through a multi-part scheme to overturn the results and block the transfer of power.
Welcome back to America Decides. Back in December, during its final public hearing, the House January 6th committee unanimously issued 4 criminal referrals against Donald Trump. Less than a year later, the former president's legal situation looks drastically different. Nevertheless, Trump has remained defiant. California Democratic Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren joins us now. She previously served on the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th attack. Congresswoman, good to see you. Thank you so much for being here. I want to talk a little bit about your committee's work, because when you read the indictment from Special Counsel Jack Smith, you see a lot of similarities between that and the work that your committee did. What kind of role do you think the committee played in getting to this point?
Well, I think actually we played a more important role than I understood at the time. We, of course, investigated the plot, and the ex-president was at the center of that multifaceted plot to overturn the election. We interviewed, over 1,000 witnesses, and I assumed that the Department of Justice was doing the same thing. It turns out they were focusing almost entirely on the foot soldiers, the actual rioters, and it wasn't until we were able to reveal publicly the extent of the plot that went up to the highest office in the land that I think they began looking beyond the foot soldiers themselves.
Yeah, I want to ask a little more about that, because earlier this week I spoke to one of your Democratic colleagues, Brendan Boyle, Democrat from Pennsylvania, and he was very critical of the Justice Department and Attorney General Merrick Garland, saying they didn't move fast enough. I'm wondering if you share some of those criticisms of the Justice Department in terms of the timeline and how they acted here.
Well, when Jack Smith was appointed special counsel, things moved rapidly. I do wish that the special counsel had been appointed earlier, because all of this could have been earlier than it is now. But that's in the rearview mirror, nothing to be done about it. And I look forward to seeing what happens next in the court of law.
I also want to ask about some news today that we are learning about this special memo from one of President Trump's, someone in President Trump's circle, the secret memo outlining a strategy for former President Trump to overturn Biden's win. And this essentially involved getting an alternate slate of electors. I'm wondering if your committee knew about that memo.
We knew about some of the memos from Cheeseborough, but not the one that's been in the news today. We uncovered the plot to have these fake electors. It was went right up to the president himself, and it was illegal. And we made that known in our report, although we didn't have all of the memos that are being discussed. We had one from earlier in November and December.
And you also have said before, too, that, in the indictment we learned that Mike Pence, the former vice president, of course, took notes and shared those with the committee. You have said that the committee shared them with the special counsel, I should say. You have said that the committee did not see those notes. Is that right?
That's right. We were unable to interview Mike Pence. We subpoenaed him, and he declined to come in. Of course, the special counsel has more tools available than a congressional committee, and he did go in to talk to them. So there are things that we were unable to find out, like his contemporaneous notes. And when President Trump told him, "You're too honest," we didn't know that either. But we learned a lot from his chief counsel and his chief of staff. But not everything.
In addition to those notes or the existence of them, was there anything else that you learned that you didn't know that came forward in this indictment?
Well, I didn't know that Trump had told Pence, "You're too honest." I mean, that tells me a couple of things. One, that Pence refused to violate his oath, but I guess Trump realized that he was being dishonest in that statement. And number two, I didn't realize how close we came to Trump ordering the military into American cities. That's pretty chilling. If he had succeeded, there would have been demonstrations, and that's why, quote, we have the Insurrection Act, which of course allows for military to be dispatched. Very unsettling.
And there, of course, is also this looming case in Georgia. Of course, that's not a federal case, but I'm wondering kind of everything you've seen from the indictment, from Jack Smith, and also the work that your committee is doing, anything that you may expect to see if charges are in fact brought in that case.
Well, I don't know what the Georgia case is, except what I read in the newspapers. It looks like they are exploring the fake elector issue, which, of course, we also identified. What else they're looking at, I don't know. And, of course, it's violations of state law that they will be pursuing, not the federal statutes that we looked at.
Well, Zoe Lofgren, Congresswoman from California, a member of that January 6th committee. We thank you very much for your time, and we'll see how these investigations play out.
Okay, you take care.
And President Biden is set to speak in Utah tomorrow, and that's where the FBI says they shot and killed a man who was posting death threats against the president. We'll update you on the latest next. You're streaming America Decides.
An original documentary from CBS reports. Controversial Congressman George Santos.
Why won't you answer our questions?
How did he manage to get elected?
Thank you very much, and God bless you, and God bless the USA.
George Santos' campaign was a campaign of deceit, lies, fabrication.
And who is he, really?
I knew him as Anthony Dvoldar from Queens.
Really, who he is, he's a fraud.
I compare him to the Tinder swindler.
From people who know him, the truth, the facts, the lies.
He would say that he was worth $100 million.
It's an incredibly cynical episode in American politics, beyond satire.
Had you ever seen anything like this?
No, and I hope I never see it again.
Campaign of Deceit, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
She dazzled on the court and off the court as a businesswoman. Thank you for joining us on Person to Person. Tennis superstar and entrepreneur Serena Williams.
An original CBS Reports documentary.
I asked my students, what are we going to do about racism in the United States?
The backlash over teaching about racism in American schools.
I don't think it has any place in the classroom.
We can either pretend and say, no, we're not racist and we're all great people, or we can actually start to do the really, really hard work of addressing it.
How did you lose your job?
I made the statement that white privilege is a fact.
Is it helping diversity and inclusion?
When you bring in different people's stories and experience, it enriches education.
If you don't talk about something, it doesn't go away.
Or driving us further apart?
What schools are doing to our children in the name of anti-racism is in fact teaching them racism.
The intention is to put us in this war against each other.
An original CBS Reports documentary, streaming now. An original CBS Reports documentary.
I was entitled to equal pay for equal work under the law.
Does the Supreme Court's power need to be checked?
9 Supreme Court justices, 5 of them said no, she's not entitled. That's not right.
Calls to fix the court tend to go along with the politics of the moment.
Republican-appointed justices have all tended to go in one direction, with the Democratic-appointed justices tending to go in another.
Even though it's only 9 justices, it takes 5 of them to make the law of the land.
Does it have political impact? True. Political intent? Probably not true.
If the American people don't trust the judgment of their court, that's a real problem for our democracy.
An original CBS Reports documentary streaming now.
On our places, bright shiny faces.
When you wake up in the morning, we want to be your go-to team.
I don't go to work in the morning. I go for coffee with my 2 good friends, and we talk about the world.
Welcome back to America Decides. Law enforcement sources tell CBS News a man who was shot and killed during an FBI raid allegedly posted online death threats against President Biden. The president is set to speak tomorrow in Utah. On social media, the suspect allegedly referenced the president's visit and threatened to dig out camouflage gear and a rifle. CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe joins us now. Ed, what a story. Yeah. President's still going to Utah, but what happened here? What do we know?
This man, Craig Robertson, is in his 70s. He lived in Provo, Utah, which is about 45 minutes south of where the president's headed to tonight in Salt Lake City. The FBI had been tracking him for about 5 months. Back in March, he made a threat against Alvin Bragg, who is, of course, the Manhattan district attorney, on Truth Social, the platform favored and founded by former President Donald Trump, saying in part that it was his plan to go to New York and fulfill his dream of killing Bragg, waiting him out in a parking garage and then killing him. Subsequently, FBI agents in Utah were flagged this. They went to this gentleman's house, observed him later that same day. As it is described in the 39-page complaint, he was wearing a suit, a white shirt, a red tie, a lapel pin with an AR-15 style rifle, a lapel pin, and a camouflaged Donald Trump hat. They were able to track him over the next few days and then began reviewing his social media on Facebook and other platforms. And they found more than 24 examples of him making threats against the president, the vice president, Alvin Bragg, Letitia James, the New York Attorney General, and then Merrick Garland, of course, the Attorney General of the United States. What do those 3 prosecutors have in common? Of course, they're overseeing criminal and civil proceedings against the former president. The FBI went today to arrest him. There was some kind of confrontation. He's now dead. But that happened, of course, hours before the president's supposed to arrive in Utah tonight as part of this 4-day Western state swing that he's on to promote his agenda and to raise money for his reelection campaign.
I mean, this just goes to show how, these statements that have been made in the political sphere have real consequences. And people are hearing them and acting, apparently, about to act on them.
And one real quick thing that our CBS News consultant, A.T. Smith, who's a former deputy director of Secret Service, he said, it is often the case that people like this, who might have been making threats against the president, the vice president, the first lady, and live in an area where they're about to go, may be put under extra surveillance or may even be arrested because of the more recent threats made against those protectees. So he said this happens quite frequently. We don't actually hear about it that often. This one, however, given the volume of his threats made on social media and his interactions with the FBI agents who had been investigating him, warranted them moving in today, but unfortunately led to his death.
Words have consequences. Really quickly, you mentioned why the president is out there to promote this climate change agenda. He actually spoke with our partners at the Weather Channel, and I want to play a little bit of that sound.
We've conserved more land. We've moved into, we've rejoined the Paris Climate Accord. We've passed a $368 billion climate control facility. We're moving. It is the existential threat to humanity.
So you've already declared that national emergency?
Practically speaking, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so practically speaking means
he hasn't.
What?
He hasn't done it. He's faced pressure from environmental groups, from the left wing of his party, to declare a formal national emergency on climate change, which would allow him under national emergency authority to do a lot more things with executive authority to try to combat extreme weather. Hasn't done it under pressure from members of his own party, from Republicans who say they try to block it. And of course, if Republicans are trying to block it, there's a chance a handful of moderate Democrats in the House and the Senate would join them in doing so, and it would create more of a political problem. So he says they practically have done so through a myriad of things that he's enacted or he's approved. The Inflation Reduction Act, of course, includes a lot of money to deal with climate change, but it is not the national emergency that the left wing of his party is pushing for. Ruben Gallego, for example, who's running for the U.S. Senate in Arizona, where he did that interview, is among those pushing him to do this, saying it's absolutely necessary. His state, of course, seeing record heat this summer. Why wouldn't he push to do that? The president, though, to our friend Stephanie Abrams at the Weather Channel, trying to make it seem as if he's done it, but he hasn't. The White House not happy that this has become the focus of the trip. That also included conversation about the other economic legislation passed, and then tomorrow a veterans bill that was passed a year ago this week.
And that pressure for the left flank, you need that enthusiasm for your reelection bid. Ed O'Keefe, thank you very much for covering all of that ground for us, and thank you for watching. And that does it for us today. You can stream America Decides Monday through Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern. You're streaming CBS News.